Shaping the political message is not an easy process, nor is something that can be done quickly. Whether it's for the purposes of enhancing or shifting the Overton window of a small group, a political party, a town, or an entire country, the tools are more or less the same, but the process varies quite a bit depending on the size, the scope, and the time frame available. The one thing it doesn't depend on is the ideas. And that's what scares a lot of people, particularly on the left. The smart ones know all too well that their process can be applied ad infinitum with any set of ideas. That is to say, political hegemony is not guaranteed. No, not even in a dictatorship. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative and another class on practical politics. Now, although I started this video with a broader statement, in this video I'll focus on three tools in the arsenal of any political operative: seeding, priming, and active measures. In the past, as older subscribers are keenly aware, I have also explained in great detail a lot of other tools for political operatives such as subversion, black propaganda, polarization, framing, turning the tables, spin via statistics, and the importance of institutions. All of these and a few others are available on this channel in the playlist called simply Practical Politics. So today I'm adding to that glossary of knowledge three more tools, though active measures is basically an extension or a generalization of the points already explained in my interview with Jonathan Sorochkin conducted in Israel about 14 months ago. Anyway, before going into each of these tools, it bears repeating that no single tool represents a silver bullet. An effective political operative and an effective campaign or political operation makes use of most, if not all, of these tools. It also bears repeating that this business is, in addition to being messy, it is also, at least in part, a form of art. So what I'm saying and what I'm trying in these videos is to establish the science part, because the science part is half of the job. I routinely say that any political effort is 50% science, 40% art, and 10% luck. So if you're a bit lucky and get the science right, you'll get some of what you want more often than not, even if you suck at art, as I do, because I couldn't do good art even if my life depended on it. Which is why I work hard to avoid my life depending on art. And perhaps why I try to befriend so many artists in order to hopefully have someone else do that for me. Anyway, another point that needs to be borne in mind is that the science of this does not care about your ideas. Or in other words, the tools don't have an inherent moral value. Black propaganda, active measures, priming, subversions, all of these are just tools, like hammers, drilling machines, knives, or lighters. What people do with them has a moral value, but they themselves don't. I know I've said this multiple times, but given how much resistance so many on the non-left put against the idea of learning to use the necessary tools, this needs repeating even if I end up sounding like a broken record. So, with that said, let us begin. Alrighty, so let's start with seeding and work in the order that they should be applied. So, seeding is the process by which the elite tries out ideas without letting too many people know about it. Now, this sounds horrible, but more often than not, it really isn't. In fact, every successful and most of the unsuccessful political projects go through this phase, whether they call it seeding or not, or even whether they're even aware of it happening or not. The process is not a one-time thing. In fact, throughout the political project, seeding should occur multiple times. If it doesn't, then something's really wrong with that political project. So the question is not whether political projects don't do seeding, the question is whether they do it right. And the better you do the seeding, the better your later development of the project will look like. Now, history has shown us that one can have political projects with essentially no seeding, or with terrible seeding. One such example is the French Revolution, which clearly did not go through the seeding process when it should have been, and went through the seeding process when it did not matter anymore. So what is seeding, and how does one do it? Well, the shortest intelligible definition that I can give is like this: figure out all of the acceptable ways you can go with this. How does that work? Well, I think it's easier to just give an example. Let's say you are appointed the political operative tasked with running the campaign for Alternative für Deutschland in Berlin. Nothing personal, I'm just giving this example because that particular election is quite soon, and it's one of those complicated ones that requires careful seeding. Presumably, the goal is to at the very least do better than last time when AfD got just 14%, if I recall correctly, or 14.5%, something in that ballpark. So from that position, seeding kind of looks like this. You gather all the relevant local officials and the team leaders. This should be no more than 20 people given AfD's size in Berlin. Basically, you gather the local elite of your party. Again, AfD is just an example. The same is done if you're CDU, SPD, or any other political party, really. And the question you need to find the answer to is this: what does the party want? Now, it sounds easy, but it really isn't. Sticking with this example, AfD could very well want to outright win, or be content just with expanding its support to, let's say, 18%, or 20%, or something more in line with the overall score they got in the 2017 election. I don't know the answer, I'm not part of AfD, but this is how seeding ought to start. Figure out what you want. Now, once that is out of the way, then figure out the real program. The real program is what you really want to do, which almost always is slightly different than the program you put up on the website or in manifestos. Again, this sounds horrible when you put it in these words, but everyone does this and it just simply makes sense. You can't please everyone and you can't give equal priority to all issues. Reality simply doesn't work that way. Now, I'm not saying promise stuff and then don't do it, or worse, do the opposite, but I am saying that before promising anything to anyone, be honest with yourself and with what you, as a political party or as a group, as a project, you want to do. Now, once that is also out of the way, then comes the hard part of seeding, namely to hash out all of the possible approaches, including those that may not please the entirety of the elite. This is the part that many on the non-left simply don't do, and that is to their own detriment. Because again, the reason most of the seeding process is supposed to be amongst the elite is precisely because it's the process by which the operation is honest with itself. So, in sticking with the example of AfD Berlin, here are the 5 questions I would ask if I were the chief operative of the local campaign. 1. Do we oppose the rent control agenda of the current administration? Now, keep in mind that many of our potential voters might like it. By the same token, by opposing it, we may take away some of the votes from the CDU. Those votes may not necessarily come to us, but those people may end up staying at home. You know, politics is not just about how many votes you can take, but also about how many people you can convince not to vote directly for your opposition. Now, number 2. Do we enable any active measures this time around? As always, the risks are the same. If we're caught, things can spiral out of control, but usually we're not caught. And last time around, the benefits were quite decent. I will explain active measures in great detail, just be patient. Third question I would ask: how do we approach immigration? Do we go with the same message that we go with down in Bavaria? And if not, how do we tailor it? Let the elite give examples. Number 4, are we willing to just take it when it comes to physical violence perpetrated against us, just like we did in previous rounds? And if yes, then what are the measures we're comfortable with? If not, same thing, what are we comfortable with in terms of mitigating strategies? And finally, number 5, is there anything in the past, recent or far away past, of both the main candidate and any of the council candidates that is rotten and can, or better said, will be used against us during the campaign that I, the leading political operative, should know of? So basically, has any of you talked nasty on Twitter? Has any of you had any lawsuits filed against you for daring to be not diverse? Any of you been through a divorce? Really, anything is fair game. So I'd better know about it now and mitigate as much of it as possible before we even tell anyone that you're running. Of course, if the example had been SPD, the questions would have sounded slightly different, but the broad idea is pretty much the same, and that's because these are tools. So it's usually 2 questions on policy, 2 on tactics, and 1 about personal details. Once you have the answers, the real ones, away from the cameras and the praying eyes of the opposition, then comes the ironing out part of seeding, deliberation on tactics. Not the details of it. That's up to the political operative to be decided on the fly, depending on upcoming circumstances not entirely known at the moment of the seeding process. Now, what I mean by deliberation on tactics is putting the elite on the same page as much as possible with the broad picture of how we're going to run this. One of the efficient ways of doing this, although I'm not personally a big fan of it, is called just like that, deliberative democracy. I'll put in the low bar a longish legal essay on how that works. Now, the idea of deliberative democracy applied on a whole society is, in my opinion, appalling, unjust, and insane. But applied on a group of 20-ish people who constitute the elite of a political project is pretty efficient, precisely because presumably all of the elite is already broadly on a similar page and with roughly similar interests. So putting those in agreement through deliberative democracy is doable. Now, once you got that fixed, then you kick out from the room anyone who is not directly connected to propaganda. Now, this could be difficult in the case of IFD because they routinely don't have such a person. I'm serious. And the German peeps watching this know all too well that this is the case. In any event, the point is that the final part of seeding does not require the elite, the presence of the elite in the suits. In fact, it may be counterproductive. The final part requires just the presence of those who manufacture propaganda and of the logistics officer. The logistics officer is usually that person that knows people, and if the organization is meritocratic, that person also coordinates the distribution of propaganda or the dissemination of propaganda. With these people, one discusses all of the possible ways of approaching all the issues for the project in this case being the campaign for Berlin. Now, this takes time. Several days at the very least, but it has to be done. If one doesn't do this, then one would be mistaken to then move to the second step, which is priming. Now, I have mentioned priming before, most recently, I think about 4 months ago, when I talked about organizing. Here's what I was saying then. And finally, trying out new ideas is pretty self-evident. You're in friendly territory with largely your base. This is the ideal territory where you can tout new ideas and gauge what the base is feeling about that. Call it internal priming, if you want. Oh, goddammit. Now I realize that I haven't made a video about priming yet. Okay, basically, when looking into the political future, and particularly the propaganda approach of the political future of your candidate or side, the first thing you do is decide on the framing, which is a complex process that I will not discuss in public anytime soon because it really needs concrete examples and it would take me several hours to explain. Now, once you know the framing, then you test narratives and see what sticks. That is priming. Priming is both for the general public and for the inside of your party. And when you are in a friendly area, you should not be shy to try this out. Not only you learn more about your potential voters, but you also might learn something from the voters. Okay, so what is priming? Well, the simplest definition that I can give is this: focusing on a particular aspect, issue, or small collection of talking points and ignoring all the others. For much of the last 30 years, this was understood as being a function of the media. That's why when you look up priming on the internet, you will be getting a lot of literature on priming as a function of the media, particularly the establishment, or as we call it around here, the cathedral media. But as anything that's a function of the cathedral, it necessarily has a political application as well. This is not exactly a secret, but until very recently, let's say the last 5 or 6 years or so, it was assumed that only the left knows and only the left can do this. As a result, of course, nobody was concerned. Nowadays, increasingly a lot of the non-left are also doing it, so naturally, it's suddenly a concern. Also, if one digs enough, you will find a lot of academic work on this. I'll leave the best academic paper I am aware of on this topic in the description box. Again, this is no surprise. Priming as a cognitive process has been studied for decades. The application of it is a bit more complicated than academics think, but that's none of my business. Academics are routinely wrong, especially those in the current year. The point is that you can't have an effective campaign, and definitely not a winning campaign, without priming. Now, many operatives prefer a more complicated categorization with multiple layers of details, but I prefer a simpler categorization because the point is for you to remember the steps rather than a complex theoretical framework. So, priming basically has 2 phases. One, internal priming that I was alluding to in the video about organizing, and 2, general or outward priming. The utmost important point is to make sure you do them in this order all the time, because the point of internal priming is to weed out narratives that cause unneeded trouble. And this is where it gets quite complicated if you don't do the seeding right. What narratives go out as a result of internal priming? Well, that decision has to be guided by the objectives agreed upon during the seeding process. So, for instance, if the seeding conclave wants a conservative campaign, that is to say, a campaign that preserves and secures the votes the party can rely on, then the harsh narratives with the potential of upsetting the base are the ones that go out on the window during the internal priming process. If, however, the purpose is to expand the base, then some of the narratives loved by the base have to be toned down. So, for instance, during the internal priming at AfD Berlin, I would test the narratives that sound the closest to the social democratic ones, with the twist that, you can't have social democracy and open borders. Sure, such narratives would piss off a lot of the base, but would those pissed off the base enough to refuse to vote for me? That's a question that should be answered during the internal priming process. And those that don't piss off the base enough to no longer vote for the party should end up being kept for the glossary of official messaging. It sounds complicated, but it really isn't. You just test out narratives to focus groups and gauge their reactions. Do that right, and the decision on which ones survive and which ones get the axe will appear self-evident most of the time, will just reveal itself. Now, if you have the money and the time to do that, not just with focus groups from within your coalition, but also with focus groups that are outside of your coalition, now that is even better. That's a winning strategy. Serious political parties do this all the time, not just during the election season. Usually, when the political operative comes in for the election season, he or she is presented with a huge glossary of internal priming analysis over the last 12 to 36 months. That's for serious political parties. Of course, less serious as well as small political parties don't have that, but they should start building it. If your political party is older than 3 years and you still don't have that, then your political party is not serious. And by not serious, I don't mean that the message of them is a joke or any of that. No. I mean not serious about winning. If you want to win, internal priming as well as discrete outgroup and focus group priming is mandatory. Now, once you have enough of that, then comes the second phase, which is basically what you say in public. That part is what your opposition sees in full as well. That's why priming is regarded in media studies alongside with the topic of agenda setting theory. Because if your outward priming is good enough, it ends up setting the tone of the conversation. If your priming is terrible, then the best you can hope for is to be a good enough reactionary. The best recent example is Boris Johnson's campaign in 2019. Get Brexit done. That's it. Simple, concise, and repeated ad nauseum about 45 quadrillion times. Even militant leftists had to admit that this was just better than what the left had to offer in terms of priming and messaging. Time magazine was noting bitterly the following, quote, "Focus groups conducted by The Guardian newspaper a week before the election found the strategy of zeroing in on Brexit was breaking through in key marginal constituencies. An opinion poll taken on December the 10th and 11th found 39% of the respondents wanting to pass the Brexit bill Johnson secured with the European Union in October, and only 15% wanted a further delay. Another 30% wanted Brexit to be cancelled altogether." The Conservatives' clarity of message on Brexit contrasted starkly with Labour, who, after years of internal disagreement over Brexit, eventually came out in support of holding a second Brexit referendum if elected, with remaining in the EU being one option. They also committed to delaying Brexit in order to renegotiate a better deal. In televised debates ahead of the Thursday's vote, voters in the studio audience criticized the party for having an unclear Brexit position. It's not hard to see why, says Tim Bale, professor of politics at Queen Mary, University of London. If you compare the two parties, the message discipline exercised by the Conservative Party was incredibly impressive relative to the very diffuse, very confusing signaling coming out of the Labour Party, unquote. And that is how you do outward priming really well. And it's not just because he won that I give Boris Johnson as an example. It's because he and the Tory campaign used exactly the methodology that I'm discussing here. Whether it was Dominic Cummings, which the media credits as the top political operative for Boris Johnson's faction of the Tories, or someone else less known, or even Johnson himself, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that the priming worked. And it worked not just because it emerged as a result of careful research, careful seeding, and very careful internal priming, but it also worked as a result of discipline. This is the other factor of successful outward priming. You need to have not just your candidate, but everyone from the top to the last volunteer foot soldier. Everyone has to exert message discipline. Similar phenomenon was seen in 2016 with Mr. Trump. 100% of the people who shilled for Trump uttered at least once the phrase, "Make America Great Again." Now sure, in a more complex campaign, like the campaign for President of the United States, you need more than just one message for priming. But even in complex ones, the same rule applies. You need a central message that emerges out of careful seeding, well-made internal priming, and message discipline during the dissemination process. Then repeat the same with others. Even in complex campaigns, you don't need more than 3 or 4 messages, because that's why it's called priming. You prime the public with just a few narratives, preferably easy to remember, and ignore all the rest. President Trump had what? Make America great again? Build the wall? Drain the swamp? Or replacing the corrupt Washington establishment? And disastrous trade deals. And that's pretty much it. And on top of that, he also used our country, us, our movement, and massive illegal immigration as talking points. That's it. That's Trump 2016 priming for you. It's literally 26 words. 26 words repeated by Donald Trump at least 10 million times over 13 or 14 months of campaigning. And repeated, as President Trump would say, billions and billions and billions and billions of times by an army of political operatives, seasoned agitators, pollsters, media personalities, and regular people. Unlike the opposition, the Trump team benefited immensely from the discipline that the underlings adopted somewhat organically. The opposition, in the meantime, had what? Stronger together? Kinda weak. And it was also the only message really remembered from the opposition. And that's because the priming process in the Democratic Party was just not done well. Now, some would say that they're doing the same thing now, but I will say, shut up and don't interrupt the enemy when he's committing a mistake. So, yeah, I guess that's priming for you. I hope it's clear enough. Of course, in practice, it's a lot more complicated and a lot of things can go wrong. But then again, there is no way I can cover all of this in a YouTube video. Besides, that's what private consultation is for. So, with that said, let's move to the third element set out to be covered here. Active measures. Now, the term active measures can sometimes be controversial because, of course, it's taken straight out of the KGB lexicon, активные мероприятия, but I simply don't know a better term for this. In the past, particularly in the video called The Basics of Subversion, I have suggested that every tool presented needs to be used in conjunction with others in order to be effective. However, I have not made it clear then that active measures is a wider category rather than a tool in itself. Well, technically it can be both. Anyway, so what are active measures today? Well, active measures are the collection of actions taken by a political operation that are meant to discredit, demoralize, expose, or ruin the political opposition. Subversion and black propaganda can in and of themselves be classified as active measures if you really want to. It depends, it's a bit more complicated. But when I'm thinking at active measures, I'm thinking at really more bold moves. For instance, the New York Times, a former newspaper, acted really outraged when some low-tier BS about Cambridge Analytica was broadcasted in Britain. I believe it was on Channel 4, link in the low bar anyway. Basically, some colleague of Kathy Newman, you know, this So You're Saying woman, had a few meetings with the sales representative of Cambridge Analytica, who did what any sales representative does, namely to brag and oversell. Nevertheless, this is a good example of what I have in mind when I say active measures. So the chap from Cambridge Analytica mentioned actions such as sending prostitutes to political opponents and then filming the whole exchange, or sending someone posing as a wealthy land developer to pass a bribe. Of course, mainstream leftists pretended really hard to be outraged by this, as if this is somehow beyond the pale, even though that is exactly what they have been doing for decades. A very common active measure used by leftists for the last 20 years is precisely to send gay men and lesbian women to non-leftist politicians that they suspect may be homosexual. And if the suspicion turns out to be true, they then publicize the encounter. They still do it to this day, by the way, even though the tactic has stopped working for several years now, and in fact sometimes it yields the opposite of the expected result. But you see, sending prostitutes to left-wing politicians is absolutely haram and worthy of whining on the front page of the Pravda on Hudson, just like it's absolutely haram to do undercover journalism against Planned Parenthood, but meddling into non-leftist politicians' sex life is okay and funny. In fact, you can come out in the pages of Politico proudly declaring how noble you are for doxing people. Now look, I don't disagree with any of this, well, except for the noble part. I don't think gay marriage is noble, and in general I don't believe political agitprop is usually noble. It's not. It's dirty, it's harsh and cold-hearted, but it's also necessary. This line of work is quite similar to the one of a criminal defense attorney, if you want. You know, the criminal defense attorney has to offer the best humanly possible defense to people they know for sure are guilty. And this is why I think it's good that more non-leftists are starting to learn these things, because the left will never think twice about ruining you, even if they know for sure that they're wrong. That's why I do a lot of face-palming when I learn that individuals on the non-left have compromising true information about left-wing politicians, but then end up shelving it because, oh, it's not fair to use it. Well, if that's your thinking, then either change it or get out from the business. I'm serious. I understand the reticence when it comes to lying. I don't advocate intentional lying either, though not for moral reasons, but because I don't believe approaching leftists with morality is of any good anyway. I don't advocate intentional lying for practical reasons. If you knowingly lie and you get caught, and that's increasingly likely in the age of zero privacy, then you're toast. So that's why you shouldn't intentionally lie. However, active measures are not about lying. Active measures are about gathering intelligence. What you do with that intelligence is a different story. So, active measures are the totality of actions taken towards undermining the opponent without explicitly upholding your side. Examples of active measures today are quite abundant. Almost all intersectionalist type of institutions are essentially active measures. Think of the so-called International Lesbian and Gay Association. Sure, officially it's a human rights group. It just so happens that 100% of the politicians they support are on the furthest fringes of the far left. Just like it just so happens that less than 5% of their funding comes from politically neutral sources. In fact, almost all human rights groups are now essentially active measures. Human Rights Watch is perhaps the worst example, the most notorious one. And it's notorious because they're no longer doing it right. They no longer do active measures right. I mean, Human Rights Watch has become so bad that it is heavily contested from all sides. In the past, they would easily brush off criticism as one coming from human rights violators. But now you have the populist left, the center, most sane libertarians, significant chunks of the right, and increasingly portions of the establishment left routinely raising questions about Human Rights Watch's legitimacy, and for the most part, they're really not wrong. The SPLC is also essentially an active measures institution. Sure, it did not start that way, just like Human Rights Watch did not start that way. But for the purposes of this video, I'm less interested in how they started. I'm interested in what they are. The point is that creating institutions like these should be part of the arsenal of any political project. There is such thing as the Human Rights Campaign Corporate Equality Index, for instance, which is an operation that basically evaluates a corporation by how far left its social outlook is. There is no serious equivalent of it on the non-left. Well, it should be created, like yesterday. You wonder why so many corporations put a rainbow logo? Well, that's why. Because only the left showed up for the discussion. You didn't, because you didn't believe in active measures. Again, links in the low bar with more details on this and how this can be changed. And it can be changed, it just requires the work. Because again, as I said in the intro, political hegemony is not permanent and it's not guaranteed, even if you install a dictatorship. The content of the ideas is a lot less relevant than many ideologues would like to think. What matters the most is how long and how well are you willing to play the game and apply the necessary tools and tactics, of which active measures are an integral part of. So yeah, think tanks, ranking indexes, any institution that is not explicitly pro a certain political party or project can become a tool for active measures. It just takes time until it sticks. After all, the Human Rights Index needed about 12 years until it became relevant and another 5 until it achieved almost full control of the narrative. In the meantime, between the moment of creation and the moment they start to stick, you need a good propaganda game and, yes, an army of shills. Now, that's a story for a different video on how to organize shills, pros and cons of paid shills, and so on and so forth. Shilling, just like any other activity in this business, is part art and part science. Also, most people don't even know what a shill is. Most people accused of being shills are not, by the way. But as I said, this is a discussion for another day. So, to sum up this point, active measures are for the longer term. You don't decide to engage in active measures for this year's election or for this election season. No, you activate measures that you had already in place in the previous years. No, active measures use something you start now and keep on grinding on it, expecting results 10 years from now. And until then, you keep on working on increasing the profile of the institution. Sure, some activities that can reasonably be qualified as active measures can end up being helpful right away, like discovering that a Green Party politician invests heavily in coal mines, for instance. But as a rule, active measures is a topic for those who want to play the long game. So yeah, that's really all I had to say about these 3 tools. Obviously, the conversation is a lot longer, which is why I make these videos in this format, one class at a time, because there's no way I could fit everything in a video, even if the video were to be 8 hours long or more. So yeah, do tell me what you think. Have you engaged in any of this? And if yes, what were the results for you? I'm interested in particularities because obviously a lot of things can be very different from one town to the other, let alone from one country to the other. So yeah, and with all that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your continuous and generous support. Send me to the gulag. Seriously, send me to the gulag. Visit our website. Don't forget to subscribe. And I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.